Okay, it's great to be here. I just wanted to begin by saying that I am an original UBC alumni. I did my bachelor's and my master's degree here at UBC, and it's always great to be back. In fact, this is becoming kind of a self-invented tradition of coming back to Vancouver in November and visiting SLACE in November. So it's the second year in a row, and it's great to be here. I am always happy to be back. It's also great to be here celebrating school libraries, even though neither of these projects specifically addresses or was based in school libraries. I think there are implications for school libraries in both these studies. And it's also great to celebrate school libraries, given that I come from a province where our School Library Association disbanded several years ago. So it's great to be in a province where one still exists. That's great. So I was thinking when I was beginning the preparation for this presentation, really when I think about my research, it's gone in lots of different directions, but basically I've been kind of playing in the same sandbox for quite some time. And I think the common denominator in all of my research studies is looking at the motivating factors that make people read for pleasure and why it is that some people do and are committed readers and other people choose not to read for pleasure, not because they have any kind of literacy challenges, but just because they choose not to do it. And one of the common threads in my research has been the role of reading for pleasure in really that personal dimension, in building personal connections between people and between groups, and in that role of pleasure reading in creating community, reading communities. And so these two studies are still looking at those questions, but also looking at the way those questions play out as we move increasingly into a digital realm for pleasure reading. So the two case studies that I'm going to talk about, one is an investigation of the One Book Nova Scotia reading program, and this was a project that I conducted with Alyssa Harder, who is a student at the School of Information Management at Dalhousie, and Dr. Danelle Rayberg-Cito, who is a well-known scholar in the field of mass reading events or one book, one community reading events, and she is a professor at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. The other case study is looking at parents' perceptions of reading apps for preschool children, and this was a study that I conducted with another student in the School of Information Management at Dal. And both of these are very recent. They were both done in the past year, both fairly short studies, but meant to be exploratory studies to basically open the door for longer-term projects. So I'll talk first of all about the One Book Nova Scotia program. This is, a pretty familiar model. I'm sure most of you know the model, where a whole community gathers together to read a single book, and then there's various spin-off events, book discussion groups, author readings, etc., to stimulate interest in the book. Well, Nova Scotia ventured into this realm a couple of years ago in 2012, and this One Book Nova Scotia model, which was organized by Libraries Nova Scotia, is a little bit different in that it's not just one city that's reading a whole book, it's meant to be a whole province that's reading a whole book. So there are additional challenges with that. Given that, there's the map of Nova Scotia, it's, as you know, it's a small province, it's nowhere near as big as BC, but even though it's a tiny province, the population is actually quite dispersed. There's one big city, which is Halifax. And when I say big, it's like 300,000 people. And then there's about another 700,000 residents of the province that are scattered mostly in rural communities around the province. So they're fairly isolated from each other. So how that reading program played out to try and connect people, not just of different age groups, but also in different communities, different physically separate communities. Now, this model, the One Book, One Community model that we used in Nova Scotia, was pretty representative, pretty typical of these sorts of programs. The one slight tweak that the organizers used this past year in 2013 was encouraging the use of Twitter as a medium for discussion, since so many of the residents of Nova Scotia were physically separated and many lived in very small communities. Organizers tried to use Twitter in this past year to engage more discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that worked. So this is just a quick quote from the One Book Nova Scotia website itself, where the organizers articulate 4 goals for the project. And the one that I've bolded is number 2. So the objectives are, encouraging reading and contributing to the development of a reading culture in Nova Scotia, to create opportunities for social interaction and community development. And that was what I was really interested in, is how this project actually contributed to that, to support lifelong learning, and to allow those in the literary community to work together. So the 2 books that I looked at that were the focus of the One Book Nova Scotia reading program over the 2 years that I studied the program, the very first year, 2012, the choice was really an archetypally Nova Scotian book, written by a Nova Scotian author, Leo Mackay Jr., and the book is a fictionalized account of the Westray mine disaster, which took place in Nova Scotia about 20 years ago. So it's very clearly based on that event. It takes place in a Nova Scotian mining community, and a lot of the details are very familiar to anybody who knows anything about that segment of Nova Scotia history. The choice the next year, in 2013, was a very different book, written by an Ontario author, Alyssa York, and all about the wildlife and the people who gather in the ravines around the Don Valley outside Toronto. So very different book, a book with not any obvious connections to Nova Scotia. So I'll look at and talk a little bit about the way that played out too, and the way people engaged with the book. So the methods that we used in studying this, we didn't do any interviewing, but we did do an online survey of participants both years. And then in 2013, because Twitter was being encouraged as a medium for discussion, we analyzed the Twitter discussion using Netlytic, which is an online text analyzer. And we looked both at the networks, like what was really the relationship of the people who were responding, who were they replying to, could they be connected in any way, and what was the content of the tweeting that was taking place. So looking first at the network analysis, I'm not sure how clearly you can actually see this, but the left-hand side diagram shows basically the networks that were engaging with the Twitter conversation. That central kind of blue star is actually the official tweeting coming from One Book Nova Scotia. So they were kind of broadcasting out a lot of tweets, and what was happening was other members or other people that were following One Book Nova Scotia in other networks were retweeting their tweets, but they weren't actually discussing. There was very little connection. There was very little tweeting back. There was basically a broadcasting and then a rebroadcasting. And that's made obvious when you take away that central One Book Nova Scotia network. What you're left with is not much. Okay, there was very little activity that was going on of people in different networks who were responding to each other or who were communicating back and forth. So basically, what we found was that users weren't interacting with each other. They were really using Twitter to retweet things from One Book Nova Scotia, which is not how it was intended to be used at all. And kind of sadly enough, the longest sustained conversation we found consisted of 8 tweets, which is reasonable. That's a pretty good conversation. But the people were talking about how much they disliked the book, which is not, again, ideal. And this was in the case of Fauna. The people were complaining about the slow start, that it was not a very engaging book, and that they were actually going to stop reading it because they weren't enjoying it. It's kind of sad. In terms of the content analysis, what people were actually saying in their tweeting, most of the tweets from One Book Nova Scotia were informational, so they were making announcements, come to Library X at such and such a time and there'll be a book discussion or there'll be an author reading. There wasn't very much in the way of actual comments on the book or discussion. The official Twitter account did very gamely post some open-ended questions. Typical would be, if you were an animal in fauna, what would you be? Would you be a raccoon? Would you be a squirrel? But that didn't really result in very much conversation. People, if they responded with one-word answers. Nobody commented on their choices. It kind of fell a bit flat. A big problem was that the official One Book Nova Scotia account used inconsistent hashtags. So about halfway through the program, they switched their use of hashtag from One Book Nova Scotia to One BNS and lost a lot of followers that way. And then there were only 2 sustained conversations, one that I've already talked about that was looking at how much people didn't like the book, and then one that was actually talking about the setting and the role of the setting in engaging people's interest. And this is the conversation that consisted of 4 tweets, again, the second longest discussion, where one person commented, I'm reading Alyssa York's Fauna, very cool for this former Torontonian, looking forward to discussing it. And somebody responded, I'm really enjoying Fauna, an excellent Friday reads. And then the original tweeter said, I like it too, especially as I lived in Toronto and used to run in those ravines. Are you going to go to any of the discussion events? So clearly the setting of the book and the location of the book for these individuals really made a difference. It made them engage with the book and increase their interest in it. When it comes to our analysis of the survey, we found some pretty interesting and, again, not entirely encouraging demographic data. And it was a pretty consistent profile that, at least that responded to the survey. Certainly there may have been more people who were participating in One Book Nova Scotia who didn't respond to the survey, but the profile of the people who responded to the survey was pretty narrow. Most of the respondents were women between a very narrow age range, 50 to 59. Who would not typically be heavy users of Twitter necessarily anyway. 79%, which is way higher than the provincial average, had a university degree. 75% found out about the program through the library. So what this suggests is that, at least in terms of the survey respondents, One Book Nova Scotia was kind of preaching to the converted, in that the people who were participating and who were engaged enough to respond to the survey were kind of the profile of the typical library user anyway. It wasn't really being very successful in reaching out to young people, not very successful in appealing to men, just generally speaking, this is not a typical portrait of a Nova Scotian. This is a very narrow demographic slice. 63% of the survey respondents had some sort of tie to the book or publishing industry. Either they already worked in a library, or they worked in a bookstore, or they worked in publishing. So they had kind of a vested interest in seeing this One Book Nova Scotia program succeed. So again, not typical representative Nova Scotians, but people who were already part of that book and reading community. So raised some interesting questions about, where was everybody else? The reasons that people gave for joining One Book Nova Scotia very much to discuss the book, that it was a source of discussion through shared reading, the desire to participate in a reading community. That was what was driving people to participate, and unfortunately, at least through Twitter, that didn't really happen. It may have happened more successfully in some of the face-to-face events, but through Twitter, it really didn't take off. Some of the other reasons people gave was an interest in the author or a connection with the location, and this was especially true in 2012, where the book was very much rooted in Nova Scotia. People very much responded to that, and that was a great motivator for them to participate. In 2013, that didn't play much of a role. Most of the people who responded to the survey did not participate in any of the face-to-face events, but those who did participate, author readings were the main event that they participated in. And several people commented they were very disappointed with the Twitter discussion. They wished that it had been more engaging, but it didn't really work, and they weren't sure that, that it was very effective at all. So some of the recommendations that we came up with after looking at both the Twitter analysis and the survey analysis was that really, even though it's not one of the goals of One Book Nova Scotia to promote local authors, it's really a good idea to do that. Or if you're not going to choose a book by a local author, try to choose a book that's at least set in the Atlantic region, because that really was effective in engaging people and drawing in people who might not otherwise have participated. Programming should also emphasize the aspects of the book that unite community residents. So programming around fauna that may be related to urban wildlife in the Atlantic region, might have been a way of engaging people and drawing them in. That didn't happen. So that might be, for future versions of this event, a good way to draw people in. The publicity of for the program didn't really seem to be doing what it should be doing, which is reaching out beyond the typical already committed reader or library user. So look at different ways of advertising the program, so it's not just being promoted through libraries where you're preaching to the converted, but find other ways to advertise it and to draw people in and to get them interested. And the major recommendation that we had was really look at the way you're using Twitter. It's not good enough simply to say you're going to use Twitter and tweet once a week. That is not going to work. So really being strategic about the use of Twitter, scheduling certain times when live discussion will be happening, making sure that whoever is responsible for tweeting from the official account is asking direct questions, really engaging questions that may be more open-ended questions that may engage some more conversation and some more discussion. Tweeting regularly and live tweeting from events. There was no live tweeting at all. So during author readings or during book discussion groups, that's a great opportunity to do some live tweeting. Didn't happen, but hopefully, will happen in the future. Did happen in the most recent version of the event. And lastly, choosing an author that actually is active on Twitter would be a great step. Alyssa York does not have a Twitter account, so she didn't engage at all with participants. So having an author that would be willing to come on Twitter, talk to participants, pose some questions himself or herself, that would be a great way to reach out to people, especially in isolated communities who might not be able to make it to a live event. So there were lots of really simple things we felt that could have been done to make the use of Twitter more engaging. And I am happy to report that in the last year, in 2014, the organizers of One Book Nova Scotia did really take a look at the use of Twitter and were much more strategic and much more focused on making the conversation more active and more lively. So it worked much better. I don't have the data analyzed yet from this past year, but it is a bit of a success story. There was a lot more engagement this year. So that is positive. And then just a few references. Okay, my second case study was a different project altogether, and that is a project that we worked on just this past summer in July. And it's an online survey of parents and caregivers of preschool children, asking them specific questions about the way they read to their children and whether or not they provide their children access to reading apps. And this was a survey that was distributed primarily through Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and we got 123 responses from parents. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about ebooks for children. I know that most of you are very familiar with the history of ebooks and are well aware of the rising popularity of apps, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the way these apps have developed. Because there have been digital picture books for children around the early 90s, available mostly as CDs that children would use on a computer and sit and engage. However, these picture books on CDs usually involve some form of typing or at least some very rudimentary reading, whereas now with the rise of tablets, preschool children who have no ability to read are able to point and interact with the story in a way that doesn't involve any kind of ability to understand text. And I know you're all very familiar with apps. I've got a little link here to some demos of some apps, but I won't even go there. Now, what really intrigued us was some of the sales stats related to children's reading apps. That Christmas of 2012 was the year of the iPad Christmas present. You know, iPads were purchased in huge numbers as Christmas gifts, and immediately after that, reading app sales for kids spiked enormously. So compared to December 2011, in January 2012, children's ebook app sales increased by 475%, and that continued to increase that following February. And you know, just that sale has been tracking upward of reading apps. At the same time, you know, compared to that is the recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which recommend no screen time, and that includes TV, smartphone, computer, iPad, no screen time at all for kids under the age of 2. And yet these reading apps are being designed for children as young as 6 months. They're very much geared at this pre-reading, in some cases even pre-verbal audience. The American Academy of Pediatrics says a child's brain develops rapidly during these first years, and young children learn best by interacting with people, not screens. So we were interested in just asking parents, you know, there's obviously a bit of conflict here, there's a bit of dissonance. You know, ebook sales or app sales are going up, you know, incredibly, exponentially, and yet there's advice saying, I don't know, apps or any kind of screen time may not be a good thing for young children. So we wanted to ask parents, you know, what are you doing and how do you feel about apps? Do you let your children use them? If so, why? And if not, you know, why not? So just a quick little review of some of the literature that we used in preparing our study. First of all, you know, I think everybody accepts, and it's quite well not acknowledged, that reading to preschool children is vitally important. That it is important to do from the day of birth right through throughout their childhood. And every child ready to read articulates, the achievement of narrative skills, the ability to understand a chronological narrative, interest in print, expanding vocabulary, awareness of sound letter correspondences, and print awareness of text, as being some of the great motivators and reasons for reading to children. Every Child Ready to Read also talks about the role of dialogic reading, that it's not just reading, but it's engaging the child and having a conversation with the child about what is being read that can really encourage the acquisition of these skills. But while reading is important, play is also important, and that children read or children learn not just through exposure to books, but they learn through exposure to the real world by interacting with the world, and also through play, which encourages interaction with the real world and encourages creativity and problem solving. So, these are important contexts. So, our parents seeing that they're able to achieve the mastery of these skills through reading apps as well as through traditional means. Now, there are a few studies that we were particularly interested in. One 2014 study by Roscoe and colleagues looked at the use of ebooks in preschool settings and did video capture of children as they interacted with a variety of different e-reading devices, computers, smartphones, and iPads. And they concluded that, the app was really ideally situated to capitalize on what they called the spatial and temporal synchrony of children, because they're not just listening and they're not just playing, they're doing both at the same time. They're listening, they're potentially reading, they're playing, and at the same time that they're doing all of these things, they're learning. And so Roscoe and colleagues thought that reading apps maybe really were the sweet spot to encourage children to learn, because reading apps were able to garner children's attention and really focus their attention in a very special way. So they were, in many ways, very positive about reading apps. They also acknowledged that, for these children who are in preschool in 2014, they will be living in a increasingly electronic world. We live in one now, but for these children, it's going to be screens that is going to be the way that they interact with the world. They said electronic tools will be a chief source of textual information at school and in life. So this is reality for these children. So, giving them early exposure to technology, maybe is not such a bad thing. And they can go on to say that the virtual explosion in apps has transformed the traditional storybook into a highly interactive multimedia literacy experience. So it's acknowledging, that this is the world these children are going to be living in. Rather than fighting it, why don't we go with the flow and see if we can make these apps as effective as possible? They do acknowledge that we don't really know what the long-term impact of exposure to reading apps is for these children. They say, much remains unknown as to the impact of the digital medium on children's early literacy knowledge. This will be the first generation of children who may learn to read through an app as opposed to, traditional books. So we don't really know in the future what that's going to mean. Will that make them more avid readers, or will it turn them off reading traditional text altogether because a traditional book doesn't talk to them and play music and have interactive games? At this point, we don't really know. So they conclude by saying there's much to learn about the digital medium and its tools if we are to make the best use of all that this new age text resource has to offer in the early learning environment. At this point, we really don't know. So, they acknowledge that some parents are hesitant, and because we don't know, they're not really sure whether it's a good thing or not to expose their children to reading apps. A study by the Pew Internet and American Life Project found that by a huge margin, parents preferred print books to read with their children as opposed to reading apps. There was some difference in that tablet owners were twice as likely than those who don't use tablets to say that they prefer ebooks. But overall, 81% of respondents said they preferred print books to tablets for reading with their children. And lastly, a Morris Parish study from 2013 found that children have lower comprehension when they were exposed to a story on through a reading app or through some sort of electronic device than children who were read that story in a traditional print book format. What they found was that the focus was often on the device rather than the story. Children were very interested in poking buttons and playing with the device and playing with the games as opposed to following the narrative of the story. And this mirrors a study of adult readers that was done this past year, which found that adult readers who read an ebook have lower comprehension and less memory, less recall than people who read the same story in print format. So what Morris Parish concluded was that print books are more likely to encourage dialogic reading with an adult, to include that conversation about what's being read, and also more likely to be retained. Children have a better appreciation of the story, they understand the story better, and they recall it better when they read it in print. Okay, so our study, moving on to our study, what did we learn about parents' attitudes towards reading on a tablet versus reading a traditional print book? Well, the good news is that the parents who took the time to respond to our study were pretty much uniformly committed to reading with their kids. 98% said that they read with their children, and 88% said that they read at least once a day. This is print books with their kids. So very committed parents who, pretty much uniformly did read print books with their kids. Of the parents who responded to our survey, 53% did give their children access to reading apps. So just over half. And by far the most used device was the iPad. That was what was their device of choice. We asked them what they saw as the benefits. Why do you read to your child? If you read to your child, and that was pretty much everybody who did in terms of print books, what do you think are the big benefits of reading print books to your child? And what we found was that in parents' eyes, they acknowledged that reading with their children was really important in developing literacy skills, But just as important, in parents' eyes, was that bonding time, that time that they spent sitting with their child, reading with them. They almost uniformly mentioned that in the same breath as acknowledging the role of reading in developing literacy skills. So parents said things like, the benefits of shared reading, developing literacy skills, developing emotional empathy skills, learning about the world around her, time spent together without distractions. That is what the advantage of reading a book is, that quiet time together. Second, parents said personal interaction with my children. This is a key advantage. And then went on to talk about, and the love of a good book for fun, reference, etc. Those are all important. But the first thing this parent mentioned was that personal interaction time. Third, parent said, listed traditional vocabulary, cognitive development, imagination, and it's also bonding time, that time together. And the last parent, being close, sitting together while reading, early familiarity with words and language, recreation time together. So it seemed to be those two things that, the educational component, the learning of literacy skills, but also that bonding time and that time spent quietly together was really important. For the parents who used apps, we asked them what they saw as the benefits of apps. And the most important, by a small margin, was the entertainment value. So they acknowledged that apps were very entertaining. Second most frequent response was educational. So they saw them as being entertaining, but almost as much they saw them as being educational. And thirdly, convenient. Easy to carry a device that's got a lot of different games, a lot of different reading apps on it. So it's very convenient. Rather than carrying a bag of books, you can carry one iPad and you've got entertainment for several hours potentially. A number said that they thought that apps could increase their child's enjoyment of reading because the app was so engaging and because their child enjoyed playing with it. They were hoping that maybe that would make their child a more involved reader. And not such a frequent response was affordable. So we asked parents who did allow their children to use apps, why? What is it about apps, that make you think it's good, for your children to have exposure to these devices? And by far the most common response was the convenience and the portability. It's just so easy. We're going on a drive or we're going to an appointment. I can take my iPad and my child is occupied and happy and not restless. But some parents actually, talked at considerable length about the importance of technology and how they wanted their child to have that exposure. One parent said, children now love technology. My 5-year-old would rather use a tablet than look at books. So that's what I give him. He has the tablet instead. Another parent said early introduction to technology is beneficial. They're going to need to know this. Why not start them early? And another parent talked about the gamification of learning to read, that it provides incentives. If there's a game that, children get the right answer or they point to the right letter, it's giving them an incentive to read and it's making it fun at the same time. They talked about child-led learning that was not dependent on adult involvement, that the child could learn at their own pace and that they had built-in incentives for learning, and they thought that was a great advantage of the app. For those 47% of parents who didn't use apps, we asked them, why not? If you choose not to use apps, why is that? And what we found was that it usually was not because they didn't have a device. Most parents did. They did have an iPad, but they were choosing not to give their children exposure. It certainly wasn't because their children didn't like apps. Almost nobody said that. It was because they were making a deliberate choice. And it wasn't because the apps were too expensive. The reasons that most parents gave for not giving their children exposure or not letting them use apps on their iPad or their smartphone were basically two leading reasons. One, that they were following the advice of the American Association of Pediatrics, and they were very leery and very cautious about giving their child screen time. So they wanted to try and postpone that, delay that as much as possible, One parent said, I know that when my child gets to school, I'm not going to be able to avoid it then, but until they get to school, I really don't want them to be using a screen device. The other reason that was equal, exactly the same number of parents gave this response, was they felt that by using an electronic device, it really cut into their bonding time with their kid. That was time taken away from reading a book, sitting quietly, having that one-on-one reading time, and they were not interested in reducing that. They didn't want to do anything to threaten or challenge that bonding time. So interestingly, the parents who chose not to use an app, it certainly was not because they couldn't have given their child access. It was because they were making a very deliberate and very conscious choice not to. So some of the reasons that parents gave for not giving their children exposure to apps, just a few representative responses. Parents said, I believe the interactive nature of hard copy books provide more than just learning to read. The shared engagement in book reading is a positive experience for both partners, and this shared engagement and the interaction that occurs builds other communicative and social skills. It can be difficult to build interactive shared experiences around screen devices. Another parent much more succinctly said, I don't like to replace a parent-child activity with a device. There's too much screen time available without learning to read on a device. Third quote talks about the lack of interaction between parents and children and the child falling into the video stupor, which I thought was a great image. And then the last parent, or the last quote, it's not a book. That's the main reason I don't want my child to use apps, because they're not books. I want my child to read books. There's no human interaction, lack of physicality, encourages increased reliance on technology for enjoyment. Now, the final words, a few final quotes from parents, in parents' words. Some parents really saw the balance, and they recognized that, there's different kinds of reading, and their child was going to be learning to read in different ways, and it wasn't black or white, that there was a big gray area, and that they could choose to read print books with their children and still give their children exposure to apps, and one was not going to threaten the other. So some parents made comments such as, reading with my child is one of the great pleasures of my day. We use apps as a distraction when necessary. We're not, apologetic about it. We know there's a role for reading print books and a role for reading apps, and we use them, we think, appropriately. I said, my child loves reading stories and words and is completely content when reading and being read to, whether it's a traditional book or a reading app. So it's not one or the other, but both. Another parent said apps are a treat and used to complement our one-on-one reading, not replace it. We use both. One is a reward. One is just kind of more what we do every day. And then the final quote, it's all about balance. Children should be exposed to numerous reading opportunities and can benefit from the positive aspects of traditional reading and apps. There's things they'll get from one that they won't get from the other, and vice versa, giving them the widest possible exposure and not denying them either print books or reading apps seems to make the most sense for this parent. So the final words are a bit more balanced view of reading apps. But finally, looking at both these studies, I think the common theme in both of them is the importance of community building, making and reinforcing personal connections and bonds through shared reading, whether it's of print books or of reading apps. In terms of the One Book, One Community reading program, the One Book Nova Scotia program, that sense of community needs to be carefully structured. Clearly it doesn't happen spontaneously. And if organizers are wanting to build that kind of community virtually through the use of Twitter, they need to be really strategic and thoughtful about the way they do that. It's not going to happen just on its own, but it needs to be nurtured. In terms of the second study, the study of parents and reading apps, in that study, it was really, really clear, a very strong message that parents value that bonding time that they get by sharing print books with their children, And actually, many parents feel quite anxious or guilty about using reading apps. They're quite conflicted about it. They're not sure whether this is a good thing or not. When they do allow their children to use reading apps, they feel like maybe they're being neglectful or taking the path of least resistance when they should be doing something else. They're not totally sure whether reading apps are a benefit or not. Whereas other parents, a bit more balanced, maybe a little bit more pragmatic, acknowledge that apps are complementary and they provide a different but still valuable reading experience. That they don't replace shared reading time, but they're just a complement to it. And that is the end. So we've got about 10 minutes if people have questions.
Let me see, is this working? Thank you very much, Vivian. I'm going to carry this around because we're being videotaped. And for anybody asking a question, you talk into the mic. So hands up, please.
But don't let that intimidate you.
Thanks so much. That was very enlightening. And wondering if you do have a list of the apps that were used in the reading program, or the parents
that mentioned. I do have. I don't in the PowerPoint, but parents did mention the apps that they used, both the ones that they thought were really good, and some of the ones that they didn't like so much.
Could you list one or two of those?
Interestingly, one of the apps that appeared on both lists that was both recommended as this is my child's favorite app and he just loves it, and also one that a couple of parents commented on apps that they did not like because they thought it was way too busy and way too distracting was Charlie's Stinky Socks. A number of people really, really loved it, and there were an equally, sizable number who said that they thought this was not a good app because the story was too confused and there were too many irrelevant distractions. So.
I was just wondering, which audience do you wish to target with your one book? You have your tried and true, the lovers, and if you belong to a book club, I'm just going to say that would pretty much be the age group and the profile of the women who are in it. And I also don't find it, when they retweeted, how many times have you gone to a book club where someone's just printed something off and that's their comment for the book? For the evening, right? Sometimes it's just they find an opinion and me too, and they're comfortable. But who is it that you want to participate in one book?
Is it that traditional group of university educated women who are already library users? I think based on the goals of the One Book Nova Scotia program, it is not that group. It's that group plus because, and I think one of the reasons is that Nova Scotia has one of the lowest levels of adult literacy in the country. It's about 51%. So it is a challenge, especially in rural communities in Nova Scotia. Reading is not something that is often embraced by the entire community. So I think one of the large motivators of One Book Nova Scotia is to increase the number of Nova Scotians who read for pleasure and to make it something that a whole community will take on. So that really is a goal, and not necessarily happen, at least in the first 2 years, didn't really happen, but they're going to keep.
So you don't have a Shades of Grey book club. But, it would be very difficult to get such a wide range of interest.
Exactly. And that is one of the big challenges, is finding a book that appeals, to men and women and to young people and old people. I think older people. I think that, they tried, with 26 by Leo McKay. I think that really did appeal to a lot of people in rural Nova Scotian communities because they were interested in that history. But then the decision was the next year to find a book that was a completely different kind of book and much different feel, much less depressing. But I think that is definitely one of the goals of the program. One of the reasons why One Book Nova Scotia began was to increase the reading culture in the province, and not just to give people who are already reading yet another book club to go to.
Did you talk to the people who didn't
participate at all then? Did you survey them?
Well, that was one of the questions was, did you participate in One Book Nova Scotia? And if they answered no, then they were taken to a different set of questions. But nobody who did not participate answered the survey.
Right.
So we don't
So
know.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, I mean, we don't know then if it's a lack of publicity, which was one of the
Exactly.
recommendations, or the lack of the interest in the book, or a lack
Yeah.
of reading motivation. And, you know, in subsequent years, it would be interesting to see if
It
you
would
could
be-
get someone to talk to you.
I mean, that's always the challenge, is to find the person, you know, who didn't engage and who didn't participate, like getting that survey out to them and getting them to respond. Since we were, you know, using Twitter to, you know, to encourage people to respond to the survey. Well, if people aren't on Twitter, they're not going to see that. We had it on the One Book Nova Scotia website, but if people are not participating, they're not going to, you know, and on the Facebook page. So if people were not engaging, they weren't seeing the, you know, because it would be very
anyway,
interesting to
yeah.
know why people didn't engage. No, but there should be. There should be an app for that.
Vivian, I have a question.
Yeah.
What guidance would you give teacher librarians and public youth librarians as to how they might guide parents in evaluation and use of picture book apps, in the selection of them for their libraries? Because parents are anxious, parents are confused, and parents are coming into libraries asking, both school libraries and public libraries, asking for some guidance. So from your research, many public librarians are obviously scrambling to try to decide how to do this now, and are acquiring iPads and
loading apps
and loading
onto
them
them
up
and- yeah.
and giving workshops.
Yeah.
But what to be positive and proactive and supportive, what kind of guidance do you see is necessary?
That's a great question, and that's something that we did talk about. My research assistant and I talked about when we finished the project. And based not just on what parents were saying when they were talking about the apps they liked and the apps they didn't like, but also on the research literature, I think the number one feature is the multimedia features of an app should be reinforcing the story, and they shouldn't be irrelevant distractions. So if Little Red Riding Hood is, you know, catching butterflies off in the forest or whatever, I mean, there should be a reason why she's doing that. And it shouldn't just become an end in itself to see how many butterflies Little Red Riding Hood can catch. That should somehow play a role in furthering the narrative. So having a lot of games and a lot of distracting features on an app can actually work against the child's understanding of the story. And the classic example was the Charlie Stinky Socks, which a number of parents said, I have no idea what this story is about. I can't figure it out. How can I expect my child? My child loves playing with the games, but it's not really telling him a story, and he's not really learning a story from this app. So I think to look at apps that are fun and engaging, and where you can point at a character and have them speak, or point at a word and have the word spoken aloud. I mean, all of that is great, but to beware of apps that are just too busy and have too much going on. And the Morris Parish study, which was looking at parents engaging with reading apps with their children, described a really interesting scenario where the child would actually be interested in the story and would be wanting to read ahead and find out what happened next. And the parent would be saying, oh, but you haven't finished the next level in this game. Like, let's keep playing this game and, see where that goes. So, being really cautious of reading apps that have where the gaming becomes really an end in itself and the story gets lost, I guess. And there are lots of places where you can, well, not lots, there are several places where you can read reviews of reading apps, either professional reviews or user reviews, and using those. And a number of parents did comment on the fact that they did look at reviews, and they were very careful when they chose apps for their children. They didn't just buy the one with the most attractive animation, but they really did look at the reviews and try to choose the ones that were both fun Because if it's not fun, your child's not going to, I mean, one parent said, if it's not fun, it's useless because they're not going to engage with it, but that also has a good story or has some educational value.
So Vivian, the other day, the tech coordinator at my district, the iPad coordinator, said, "Oh, Janet, I have a new iPad app to show you called Epic, I think. Do you know Epic?"
I don't.
So anyway, it's a new free app of ebooks. And it had a wide variety of picture books and nonfiction. And after having used other ones, you know, most libraries have a subscription to Tumble Books. You know, it was interesting because all they were digitized books. And it was so interesting because he was, does anyone here know Epic? Have you used Epic? So anyways, just, you know, books and it's digitized. And then he was so excited. Now, he's not a reading specialist. Right. He's an iPad guy. And I looked at that and I went, well, wow, isn't that fascinating? So in your study, did anybody mention totally non-interactive books? Because these were not, there was no interaction at all these. At all. Zero.
Yeah, no, they didn't. They were very much commenting specifically on, you know, books that were highly interactive. Those were the ones, because these were quite young children that, you know, these are preschool age, you know, kids that didn't know how to read at all. And so what they were interested in and what they were commenting on were books that they would use on a smartphone or an iPad where, you know, there was a lot of multimedia features built in. But that's, yeah, so that's kind of going old school, like going, but it's free. And a lot of parents did say, you know, it's, you know, when they were talking about affordability and that, you know, whether price was a factor, a number of parents said you get what you pay for. And if you get a free reading app, it's not going to be very good. And it's not going to be engaging and my child's not going to play with it.
So you mentioned, did the parents specify where they're going to for the reviews?
They didn't.
Okay.
They didn't. But a number did say that they do look out for reviews. But no, I mean, there are a number of websites where you can read
Right. I'd be curious to know, like, where parents look as compared to a
Yeah, no, we didn't
librarian.
ask them where. So that's for the next study. That's a good question. Yeah.
Just going back, Vivian, to the first one book study, I'm wondering if you considered any other type of social media for your communication, you know, literature, dialogues.
Yeah, well, we did think of Facebook because there was also a Facebook group. We chose not to use Facebook for this study simply because, you know, we didn't need to use Twitter. We didn't need ethics approval, so we just took the path of least resistance and used Twitter instead. But there was I was a member of the Facebook group for One Book Nova Scotia, and it was basically used again to announce events, but not to have discussion. So it basically reinforced some of the same findings as that we found with Twitter.
I just can't think right now, but there's, you know, the challenge is to find a tool that will enable more literary depth kind of discussions, but yet be open enough for people to feel comfortable.
That's right. There's there's not too many gateways, or it's not too complicated to use, or better yet, places where they already are. So, and for this age group, if you are going to preach to the converted and use, you know, assume that is going to be the demographic engaging in One Book Nova Scotia, Facebook is probably a much better medium than Twitter, because they're probably much more likely to already be on Facebook than Twitter. But that wasn't really used as a medium for discussion, just for announcements.
I'm going to bring our session to a close and present Vivian with her little thank you card.
Oh, I thought you were going to give me an umbrella. You are. Oh, awesome. That's wonderful.
And everyone who gives a talk gets a book on Vancouver. Vivian used to.
But I know I need an umbrella, so.
So thank you very much.
That's great. Well, thank you.